Hi everyone, welcome back. Before we get into section 2, I want to clarify something that I said in section 1. We were talking about the strategic arms limitation treaties, SALT 1 and SALT 2, and there was a picture of Gerald Ford, and it was dated, I think it was October of 1973. That is incorrect. It should have been 1974, and it was at Vladivostok. So that makes much more sense because by the time he signed it, Nixon had resigned, which brings us to section 2. We're going to get to Watergate and a little bit more explanation. After this, I'd like for you to watch the video quiz on Watergate, and that'll maybe give you some more explanation and understanding of it. This won't take very long. There are only 20 slides. It's complicated, sort of, but I think that you should be able to, more than able to understand it. Let's get to it. So this building right here is the Watergate complex. It was a brand new complex building on prime real estate in Washington, D.C. It's kind of situated right between the Lincoln Memorial along the Potomac River. If you were moving like northwest towards Georgetown, it's past the Kennedy Center and that sort of thing. So it's in a really prime location in DC, and this is where the Democrats had their national headquarters, right? And this is why this is all called Watergate, the Watergate scandal. But you have to back up a little bit, and you have to know something about President Nixon. So Nixon was worried that there were people who were going to try to bring down his presidency, stop his agenda, and he was concerned about all these different things that were being leaked to the press. One of the big things, of course, was the Pentagon Papers, or were the Pentagon Papers. So that was a series of documents that were obtained by Daniel Ellsberg, who was an official with the Rand Corporation, which went and they studied the situation in Vietnam. And initially he was for it, but then he saw what was going on during the Kennedy and Johnson administration. He started keeping all of these documents, and then he was releasing them to the media. Well, Nixon thought that that was wrong. It didn't implicate Nixon at all, but he thought that this kind of violated executive privilege. These are top secret documents. They shouldn't be released. They shouldn't have leaks from the government going out to the public and that sort of thing. And so he tried to halt them, but a judge kind of agreed with Daniel Ellsberg and said, well, Ellsberg was doing this to the benefit of the American population, and so Ellsberg was left off. By Nixon trying to prevent these papers from being released, it made him look guilty, but nothing in those papers actually implicated Nixon at all. But because of these papers, Nixon wanted to stop the leaks, right? Also, somebody had leaked information to the media about the bombing of Cambodia. So there's a group of people around Nixon, his top aides, who they called the plumbers, because these plumbers are going to stop the leaks, right? He said, we're doing this for national security. They can't do that. And so they start wiretapping people. And they did this believing that they could because they were justified because they're stopping the leaks. To protect the American people from all these things going on. But the plumbers kind of turned into this group of people that were trying to reelect the president, right? And they were getting their funding by this organization, which is the Committee to Re-elect the President, which if you use the acronym for it, it's CREEP, C-R-E, Committee to Re-elect the President is CREEP, right? So CREEP was funding them, and they start doing all of these wiretappings. And what they do is they break into the Democratic National Headquarters here at the Watergate complex, and they put all these listening devices in there because they want to hear what the Democrats were going to do, right? But then they got caught. They went in there to fix their recordings, and they had put tape on the door or something, and a security guard comes and sees it, and the whole thing is blown. These people get caught, and it's traced up to the White House. So this guy right here is G. Gordon Liddy, and he was the main plumber involved. I mean, he had an office at the White House. He was in charge of this group and also a group of other people known as the Cubans. They had some Cubans there that were helping them. But anyway, so the committee to reelect the president, um, they were funding the plumbers, right? Funded by CREEP. You can see that up there. They did this in June of 1972. When they were caught, the White House denied any involvement in this whatsoever. But some people caught wind of it, and so it started to come out in the news media, right? And you can see it right here. The people who were investigating it were two reporters by the name of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and they worked for the Washington Post. So here you see their headline. Um, Nixon denies the role in the cover-up, but admits there were abuses in there. So nobody could really pinpoint that Nixon had anything to do with this. What had happened is more and more information starts coming out, and one of the leaks was a source that Woodward and Bernstein call deep throat, right? Because the information went very, very deep. And he said, and nobody knew who it was, that was the code name. He said that the White House had ordered the break-in, but the White House continues to deny, right? So they keep reporting this information, and the source keeps saying, no, the White House knew, and the White House is like, no, we didn't know. And so it's like, he said, he said. Nobody really knows for sure. Well, as more and more information comes out, people are very, very curious, and then it's going to go to Congress. Here's a picture of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward then, back in the 70s. Check out the wide sort of collars on there, the lapels, and also the ties and the hair, obviously the 1970s. This is them more recently. They've aged since this picture too. They're still around. They always talk about things. They don't like Trump at all. But anyway, this is the source, Deep Throat. For 30 years, nobody knew who this was. And shortly before he died, he came out and said, yeah, it was me. Turns out he was the deputy director of the FBI. So it went very, very high, right? So they talked about this. But anyway, because of the information that he's providing, eventually this is going to lead to Nixon's resignation as the president. All right, so anyway, all this reporting by Bernstein and Woodward, it sparks congressional investigations. So for 14 months, the Judiciary Committee in Congress, in the Senate, hold hearings, right? And they start investigating. They call all these people in. Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina, it's the guy here in the middle, he ran everything, right? He led the investigation. You had the CIA agent who comes in and says, yeah, the break-in went to the highest level of the White House. And then Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee finally said, what did the president know and when? And then a lawyer for the president by the name of John Dean said, a White House counsel, he said that the president had been directly involved. So it doesn't look good for the president, but still, there's no definitive proof. Nobody knows anything for sure. Then, as the hearings continue, an aide to the president by the name of Alexander Butterfield, he is questioned, and I'm trying to think of the senator's name, but I can't, it escapes me right now. But he was questioned by a senator on the committee and said, are there any listening devices in the Oval Office? And he said, yes. When were they installed? Around 1970, right? And so turns out Johnson had listening devices. Johnson recorded almost everything that was in there in the Oval Office, and then Nixon took out all of that stuff and then replaced it because he wanted to make sure that he could cover everything and figure out what everybody was saying, and that this would clear him, right? So what he had are these listening devices where it was recorded, and it was something like this. when it was voice activated. So whenever somebody spoke in the White House, they would be recorded, right? Unbeknownst to a lot of people who spoke in the White House. But anyway, as the investigation had continued, they appointed a special prosecutor. And the special prosecutor was a man by the name of Archibald Cox. And Archibald Cox said to the president, Mr. President, we need these recordings. And President Nixon said, no, you can't have these recordings. These are mine, and it's executive privilege. The President of the United States does not have to release information that's taking place in the White House. So it goes to a judge, and the judge orders that these tapes be released, right? So what's Nixon going to do about that? So people are like, why didn't you just destroy the tapes? Of course, that would have been obstruction of justice. Or why didn't you just get rid of them before any of this happened? Nixon actually thought that this would clear him. I have this book right here. It's called Abuse of Power, right? I've read it, and what it is, it's just really dictation. Somebody has taken all of these tapes and painstakingly typed it all up, and you can read what happened in there. It's very, very thick. But there is kind of a smoking gun part of it where it implies there's nothing very, very specific, but it implies, well, the president knew about this at the time. So anyway, this was kind of, it was it for him, right? Or was it? So anyway, what happens in the meantime is President Nixon's vice president was a man by the name of Spiro Agnew. And really, the pressure was on this administration. Apparently, Spiro Agnew hadn't paid all of his taxes. So in October of 73, he resigns, and President Nixon appoints a very popular, very well-liked congressman from Michigan, Gerald Ford. He was just a great guy. Everybody liked him, and he appoints him, and happy days are here again, you know. And so we have a vice president who is appointed who was not elected to the office with the president of the United States. So then we get something called the Saturday Night Massacre. So what happens, Nixon's furious about the Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, wanting these tapes. So Nixon is like, no, I'm not going to do that. And he tells his attorney general, who is the boss of the special prosecutor, hey, I want you to fire Archibald Cox. And the attorney general, Elliot Richardson, said, no, that would be wrong. I'm not going to do it. And Nixon was upset. So the attorney general and the assistant attorney general, or the deputy attorney general, both resigned. They're like, we're going to resign rather than fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. So they resign. And so now Nixon kind of appoints Robert Bork, who is the Solicitor General, a lawyer for the president, to fire Archibald Cox because he's kind of next in the chain of command after Elliot Richardson resigned. Sorry about that, getting all my names confused. So Robert Bork says, okay, I will do that. And Americans were outraged. So little point of information here about Robert Bork. Later on, he's going to be appointed as to the Supreme Court, right? And because he did this, at his confirmation hearings, he is just annihilated by the Senate. They just grill him, and of course they don't confirm him to the Supreme Court. So now anytime anybody goes before the Senate to get approved to become a justice on the Supreme Court and they get a really bad treatment like this, they have been borked, right? So that's kind of a new thing. Well, Nixon goes on national television after there's public outcry. You can see here, Nixon forces firing of Cox, Richardson, Rudolph quit, right? So it's just headline news. Nixon goes on there, he's like, well, I am not a crook. American people need to know that their president is not a crook, and I am not a crook. So he does that, but the pressure is mounting, right? So the Supreme Court ruled against executive privilege. He was supposed to turn over his tapes right? And the House holds hearings for impeachment. And they come up with one article of impeachment, and that is obstruction of justice. But before they could impeach him, Nixon goes before the American people and says that he is going to resign. And he does that on August 8th, 1974. Gerald Ford was sworn in on August 9th, 1974. First and only president ever to hold that office who wasn't elected as president or vice president. And then Ford appoints a vice president, and it's Nelson D. Rockefeller, who is somehow, I think, like the great great grandson of Vanderbilt, or of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Okay, so here is his resignation letter to Henry Kissinger. I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. Sincerely, Richard Nixon. That's it. And Henry Kissinger puts his initials down there. Got it. 11:35 a.m. HK. Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger at that time was the Secretary of State. So I guess for whatever reason it had to go through him. I'm not sure why. Okay, so he resigns. He had given a speech. So here's the red carpet kind of out there for Nixon. And he and his wife are leaving. Get on Air Force, or I'm sorry, Marine One, and he does that very famous goodbye right there, and he goes away. And then we get Gerald Ford is sworn in by the Chief Justice Warren Burger, right? He's right there with his wife Betty Ford, right? And then Gerald Ford has a hard time as president because people won't let Watergate go, as you can imagine. They keep asking about it and asking about it. Ford is liked a lot, right? His approval rating's at 71%, but every time he's trying to address issues that are of importance to the American people, whether it has to do with the economy or natural resources, which were really big on the list at that time, people would ask about, Nixon. What are you going to do with Nixon? You're going to pardon him? What are you going to do? You're going to put him on trial? And so Ford thought that this would be bad for the American people, bad for government. And so instead of dealing with it day in and day out, he says, I'm just going to pardon him. And so he issues a pardon. And can you imagine if the President of the United States was put on trial? It would be a circus. So he thought that this would be the best thing. And his popularity went from 71% to 50%. Ford died several years ago, and even though people railed against his decision at that time, I was listening to the commentary, and a lot of people thought, well, yeah, that was probably the right thing to do at that time, right? So anyway, a lot of people too saw this as unfair because Ford at the time, rather than pardoning the draft dodgers in Vietnam, he just offered them clemency, saying, well, you don't have to serve time or do anything like that, but you're not going to get a full pardon. You'd have to do community service. So everybody said, well, that's a double standard. It's hypocritical, that sort of thing. Okay, so we're finished with the Nixon administration. So we're moving on to the Ford administration. It's short-lived, right? He ends up coming in when Nixon resigns in August of 74. And then there's a presidential election in November of 76, right? So he only finishes out like 2.5 years, 2 years and a couple months. Yeah, about 2.5 years. So anyway, in the midterm election in 74, there's going to be one in 76. The Democrats gain 43 seats in the House and 3 in the Senate, right? During this time, they pass a lot of legislation, but Ford vetoes a lot of it too. And one of the problems that the country was facing at the time was inflation. Remember, we had stagflation during the Nixon administration, so the prices of goods were going up, right? So what Ford said is, we're going to whip inflation now, and this was a pin that they came up. This was their program. What he wanted to do is he wanted to cut the budget right? But Congress is like, no, we're not going to cut the budget. By cutting the budget, what he thought that that would do is that there would be less money out there because there's less spending, and because there's less money out there, that would lower prices. So that's what he wanted to do, and Congress refused, and we are going to see inflation increase. Okay, and then there is this incident that occurred. Some people call this the last battle of the Vietnam War. So there's a U.S. merchant ship. It's called the Maya Gez, and this is a picture of it right here. So you see all those crates on there. It's for exporting goods. Probably these are American goods that were built here that were being sent to other places. But anyway, it was seized by the Khmer Rouge, which is a communist group from Cambodia. This was in 1975. So the Marines were sent in to free the vessel and the crew there. There were 41 people who died to rescue those 40 members who were on board that ship. And as I said, it's seen as the last battle of the Vietnam War, and the names of those people who died are engraved in the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial. All right, last slide. This right here, this country that is in red is Angola. And what was happening here, there were two competing factions there. There was the Popular Front that supported the Soviet Union, as is stated there, and then there's the Nationalist Front, which had more pro-Americans, democratic leanings, and it looked like they were fighting against one another. And Ford wanted to help the Nationalist Front, right? But Congress finds out about it, and they said, no, we are not going to send aid. This looked too much like Vietnam, right? So they were really concerned about another Vietnam. Ford was concerned about the spread of communism, and really what happened is that Angola then develops closer ties with the Soviet Union, right? Okay, so I will see you for section 3. Thanks for listening.